Hi, so welcome to the third part of my casual 2020 roundup. If any of you guys read my community post and are wondering, hey, why are you back so soon? You're a fucking bitch-ass liar. Listen, so I know that this channel has pretty much consisted of these intervals where, I'm going way too hard, and then I'm burning out for, 3 months, and then I think I'm fine, and then the cycle just kind of repeats. I'm finally starting to actually truly acknowledge that this is gonna keep happening unless I change something here. I'm gonna make a separate video addressing that and addressing what I want to happen with this channel moving forward, but essentially 48 hours after posting that I regretted it. So here I am. Couple of disclaimers before I get started. First of all, this will be more casually worded than usual, and second of all, I'm only covering records that came out in the beginning half of the year. You know the drill by now. But yeah, let's just hop right into the first record, which is Machine Girl's U-Void synthesizer. Guys, this record is just on fucking crack, seriously. The swift tempos and the high impact of the instruments just makes me feel like I'm being bruised left and right, or maybe it's I should be dead on impact because I'm just getting all the blood punched out of my body, or maybe it's just all the blood vessels and arteries inside of me are just rupturing and spilling out at once. It's an incredibly fleshy, nasty ass experience, and some of this record just reminds me of vomit chunks flying all over the place. Some of the synthetics just feel slimy like insect larvae, and some of them kind of remind me of gurgling stomach acid, or I guess just imagine someone gurgling water in their throat, or a boiling pot of water on the stove. This record also uses this bass that feels really digital and fizzy and wide stretching, and I always just imagine blaring out onto a slick dance floor as lights are reflecting off of it, and it uses these hella Japanese video game type synths, and of course you have Matt Stevenson's seared curt punk shouting that has an animated punch about it, or I always just imagine a whack or a bam sound effect coming with it, and he's just fuming. He seems like he would be red in the face with steam coming out of his ears in a cartoonish sense, and his approach to expressing anger is just very showy, as if he wants there to be shock value to everything that he says, and it's all just very edgy and immature. It's just suck my dick, fuck you parents to a T. And it's also very purposefully trashy, which suggests to me that they're in this mental rabbit hole, but now they're kind of just soaking in their own filth. I feel I picture Machine Girl just surrounded by rats or insects or really any type of vermin, or it's in my head they live in this studio apartment that smells vaguely like cigarettes and BO, and has holes in the walls, and none of the appliances work, and there's no bed frame, just a mattress on the cockroach infested floor, and there are a million soda cans and beer cans just scattered everywhere. I'll rot and fuck up my life, but I thrive inside the terror on splatter just kind of sums everything up for me really well. And I mean, it's just take any fraction of a song on this record, and that will already sound head-splitting. And then it's just track by track, it is just barrage after barrage after barrage, and everything just kind of hurtles past you almost before you even have a chance to register what's going on. So in that sense, it is definitely an experience and decent for just thinking about and writing about, but I feel there are also a lot of obvious weak spots on this thing, and a lot of moments that don't really hold up on their own. I feel a lot of similar ground is retread throughout the runtime, and just after the novelty of it kind of wears off, it's not that substantial or hearty an album experience. Although I will say the one takeaway I had from this thing is Scroll of Sorrow. I love this track. It's just edgelord heaven, seriously. And it's so melodically satisfying, and just, I love the pitched vocals on this thing, and the parts where they kind of glitch up, and just the, fake it online, make it offline. Anyway, next up I want to talk about Circles by Mac Miller, which has writing which is very down to earth and barefaced and comes across like it could just be coming raw from a journal. It feels a little bit stream of consciousness to me as well, and I kind of see the whole project as him trying to internalize the fact that really more than anything, life is a self journey, and how much you enjoy yourself just comes down to what's happening inside of you. and you can't really blame anyone else or your circumstances for what happens to you. It is just very introspective and self-scrutinous in that way. It's just like a careful, incremental recovery process, and you can really tell that he's just taking it one day at a time and allowing some weight to come off of his shoulders and not taking life so seriously, just releasing that good old allostatic load. And the instrumental palette on this thing is quite varied, but I also feel like there's definitely a simplicity and a modesty about the way that everything's pulled off and presented, and there's also just an immaculate finish to this record. So in that sense, it kind of feels like a hygienic or sanitary sort of experience. And I really dig the way that some of the electronics on this thing sound, like the silvery, spritzy synths on Complicated, and I also feel like the vocal loops on Blue World have that same finish about them. And they're just very snappy and really just glow against the dimness of the rest of the instruments. And I also really like the approach to circles because it just feels so light and like almost weightless because these instruments are just very minutely sprinkled into it. Like it legitimately sounds like stress release. And I feel like I could compare the sensation that I get from this track and really from the record as a whole to like how it feels directly after a mental breakdown, where you're just experiencing like this natural come up and a bit of a floaty sensation in your chest, and you know, it's like things are starting to come back into focus and get less cloudy, and you're like somewhat seeing a way forward, and you also just feel like you've been washed or rinsed clean. So it's just like you're washing up on the shore of your life and realizing, hey, maybe there is still something here. But there's still just so much clutter and weird lingering bitterness just sitting in your head that you're gonna have to gradually untangle to move forward. And on this record, that feels carefully pieced together, and you get equal parts natural optimism and natural pessimism from this state. And it really does come across like he's being as rational as possible, but at the same time, it's like he just has an honest to God lack of belief in things ever getting better, and that's what really cuts about it. Like his perspective on good news just makes so much logical sense. It's genuinely kind of uncomfortable, because it's true that everyone is always going to act in their own self-interest and do what's best for them first, and no one can ever just unconditionally be there for you. But I feel like this has kind of led to this wider general attitude that your presence in your friends' lives can't even pose them the slightest inconvenience, and it's just like a feedback loop that keeps reinforcing itself, and like people think they're more justified in just dipping out without reason, and it's just kind of like a friendship is still a two-way street. Like you put in some effort and you receive something back. And there's also the line on the last track, the only place that you know is something that nobody can ever see, which just reminds me of how like the very instant that you feel you're like actually being candid about some deeper part of your psyche or your soul or what you deal with, it becomes more about the burden on the other person than anything. But again, it's like it never comes across like he's trying to blame anyone else for where he is at. And one other thing I will say about this record is that even the tracks that struck me as the most lyrically organized had a couple of filler lines, and I think that's just a thing in general. Like, you do kind of have to dig to find the uniquely insightful sentiments, but, you know, Mac Miller has never struck me as someone who's trying to make these anomalous statements, and it does help that, like, you can tell that everything that he writes is important to him, but at the same time, it's like, he doesn't have the most stimulating vocals, and his kind of sluggish, lethargic little cadence can kind of bug me in a full album listen, and I just overall don't think that they're enough to carry an entire, like, straightforward singer-songwriter record. Like, this just kind of leads to a couple of tracks feeling a bit tepid and lukewarm, like That's on Me and Surf and Everybody, but I feel like overall I still appreciate this for what it is. And next up I want to cover Gray by Moses Sumney. The amount of vulnerability to this record is just ridiculous. Like, even if you just look at the cover, it's like this bare skin against a slab. Like, it almost feels sacrificial to me in a way. And then, of course, you have just his very scrawny voice that's just like this very thin, fine falsetto that has enough strain on it to just sound like it's about to snap or crack like a fucking twig. And I feel like for some reason when I'm listening to this thing, I'm just picturing like a scraggly, tattered up bird. That might be because of some of the fluttery instruments like the saxes and the flute and some of the very skin and bones arrangements, and again, just his voice. On the first half of this record, I think there are a few tracks about feeling like a slave to capitalism. Like, on Gagarin, it's the way that Moses repeats, like, I wish that I could give my life to something greater. And Conveyor has like these wheezes looped through it, so of course they're being rolled out in these regular cycles like they would be on a conveyor, and that mimics how essentially your destiny will always be to be a tiny piece of this larger machine that it's more than possible you have no personal investment in, and people are just boxed into such little opportunity here, and that very monotonous automated feeling just becomes torturous after some time. And also, it's clearly stated or implied a lot throughout this record that Moses is talking about his lack of masculinity. Like, Viril's lyrics paint this image of him on a mountain experiencing this profound moment of realization that he's just not the masculine guy that people have always wanted him to be, and that's fine because nothing really matters anyway. And just all the turbulence inside of you logically doesn't need to be there because it's just gonna disintegrate into the earth one day. And that fluttery flute in there just sounds like birds circling around him, and simultaneously the track sounds very tightly clenched, I think because somehow the drums sound like just gears turning in there and are also just these very hard-edged knocks, and the bass keys and the guitars, depending on what point in the track you're at, really contribute to how it's able to just build up this incredible magnitude and feel like if it goes any larger, it's just gonna make the sky burst open. And I just love the fact that it's trying to communicate that, like, that is the power in knowing the truth in solitude. I like the fact that on Boxes he suggested, like, I don't want to be put into a box as a black man, and on also and was kind of advocating for, like, acknowledging the multiplicity within yourself, or just how complex you are as a human being. And I felt like there were several tracks on this thing that you could interpret in a lot of different ways, but for me, it's like I was finding a connecting thread through the way that I was reading them. It came across like he was simultaneously talking up the idea of being with multiple people romantically as this, like, invigorating, just polychromatic kind of experience, but mostly was still focusing on how afraid he was of its reality, like on Neither Nor and on Two Dogs. Like, on this track, the black dog and the white dog for me represented how, like, at the max high you can achieve, you'll also get these extreme lows, and eventually all of it will just die into a gray, but it's like, at least it happened. I felt like Cut Me could kind of tie into that, because it's like, on this track he was saying, yes, it'll hurt, but the days and times when I feel the best, I'll have this holistic sense of freedom that I can't find anywhere else. And it's like, I feel like when you're alone, you're just less afraid to feel natural pain, so everything just feels a bit more equalized inside of you, and it's like you also grow the most in pain, so it's just a weird thing to figure out. But at the same time, it's like on Bystanders, for example, there's the line, you used to embrace the eerie and helm visitations from spirit realms, and now you plead to be plain. And I took this as, like, now you lean more on the side of monogamy because the reality of these situations scares you, and that sucks. And also on this track, there is the line, what's the use in confessing the truth to an executioner in a booth about the dueling forces in you? which I took as like, why would you directly try to work this out with someone who very well might be just chiefly trying to take advantage of you? Like, I do feel like polyamory kind of gives people more room to just lie to you about their intentions and how much you truly mean to them. And that very much goes along with the line on neither nor the romance of the undefined was a threatening lie in their eyes. And of course, you have the entirety of Polly as well. And I wanted to note that the production in the second part of this record becomes either extremely bare, like on tracks like Keeps Me Alive and Lucky Me, or it's vast and layered and bolstering up the vocal melodies. Like, I feel like those become the driving force behind it. And like the pads and glimmery keys and tracks like Two Dogs and Bystanders and Me in 20 Years just feel like the touch of something as sweet as honey and as soft as like a sunrise, with these subtle pinks and oranges just being like evenly spread into it. I also feel like the second half of this record has heavier sentiments, and this time they're all to do with relationships, and it comes across more like Moses is speaking about something in retrospect, like from the outskirts of it rather than actively involved in it. Like on Me in 20 Years, he's imagining there being like this huge gap of time to where there's no one he's romantically fond of, and it just starting to feel like he's slowly rotting into the goddamn earth, and it being a lot harder to believe that this won't be forever. And just the impact that this one person had on him lasting unfairly long and putting this cavity inside of him and leaving him no choice but to become cold. But on the flip side of that, it's like he does definitely have pride, and it starts to feel that much more incredible that he's persevering through it. And I love the detail on this track where it's like he's looking at his hand and stretching his fingers out, because it's like this moment of realization that he's still in his body. And I love the fucking drums on this track. Like, to me, they sound like just a snake slithering out, and then there's like this metallic crash, and I'm just there like, fuck yeah. And I think on Keeps Me Alive and Lucky Me, it's like this curiosity has remained inside of him over whether monogamy could still work with someone in the future or in theory, just despite everything. But then Bless Me is like this very confident moment of realization of the plain and simple fact that he and this person had no future together. And, you know, for once, it's not anything specific that he says in this track that gets to me. It's just the strain on his vocals in the climax, and just the way that he's singing with his entire chest, but he's being just swallowed in this enormous sweeping instrumentation. It just rips me up like nothing else. And then, in all honesty, I do kind of feel like Keeps Me Alive and Lucky Me are a bit strangely placed and just halt the momentum of Me in 20 Years a bit too much, but at the same time, it's like without these tracks, would the second half just kind of feel like a way too linear build and intensity? I don't know. It's just like altogether, I feel like this record is right on the edge of having an uncomfortable flow, but I'm just like barely okay with it. And I do feel like this record suffers the tiniest bit from just being so instrumentally varied that, like, when you zoom out, it lacks concise identity and feels a bit nondescript, but it's just like exploratory on its own terms, and like it definitely doesn't strike me as the type of record that's like trying to change the shape of music to come. Most of its redeeming qualities just lie in its ability to personally connect with people, and most likely it'll either do that for you or it won't really stick, but it definitely stuck with me. And next up, I want to cover this new Muju album. This thing is full of these like modest, frigid, buffed house grooves and glimmery, balmy melodies, and it is just stuffed to the brim with these trickly, sizzly, glittery little embellishments and frequencies that'll sting your ears, and it has some really long-winded, detailed progressions. Like, seriously, there are so many little shifts and miniature additives in these tracks all the time, and they're really layered, and different melodies are constantly poking through and surfacing and then fading. I do kind of feel like there's so much going on this record that occasionally it does backfire. Like, I'm not that into Fake Snowflake. This track is built around these synths with a really epic pulse about them, but then, like, it sounds like a big-ass wind chime is just, like, crashing into this track incrementally, and, like shimmering or scintillating very exquisitely, I do admit. And then there's also a point where it sounds like a rooftop is like breaking into this track, into these very dainty, fine pieces. And I feel like these two things really agree with each other, but they just completely clash with the synth loops and the drums. Or like, for example, on the track Road Loop, I kind of feel like the telecom beeps don't complement the warmth of the pads and the glimmery keys. And it's like the entire track is built around these two things that feel pretty at odds with one another. But like everything feels a lot more harmonious on the third track, for example, which has like this cold glacial synth bass loop, and these beeps are speckled in that kind of remind me of like a robot being reprogrammed. And it also has like these spritzy synths that like remind me of like the stream of water coming out from like a boat or jet ski motor. And you know, it's still like a lot, but none of it feels actually discordant. And I also really like the track Kato. The way that this pulsates just makes me feel like something is getting closer and closer to me and like pushing me back, or just moving everything I see from side to side. The track just really feels like being inside a dark club and seeing everything through unfocused eyes, and then like everything starting to come back into focus every so often and just looking really blank and silent and alone for whatever reason. But yeah, my main issue with this really is just how cluttered it can feel. Like, I feel like if this guy just came through with a nice, modest composition every so often, or just like knocked out half the textures in a given track and made the melodies a bit more striking, it could be incredible, but that's just me. And next up, I want to cover this new Nathan Fake album. I feel like this record's sound palette wouldn't feel incredibly stimulating. Like, it's pretty down to business. It just uses like these retro synthesizers that kind of feel like digital signals of sorts, or it's like they're just being spun into an Arctic cyclone or some shit. I guess I do feel like each instrument has like a subtle quality about it that adds a little bit of color. Like, the synths sound really sleek and greasy, and the ambiance just glows brilliantly and reminds me of like gusts of winter air. And the drums have a pretty satisfying crack or clap to them and just remind me of like crunchy leaves sometimes. And I feel like the sharp drums against the cool synth work is probably why I'm always picturing like snow-covered mountains when I hear this thing. I feel like the main synth melodies on this record as well have timbres that are like constantly shape-shifting. Like, imagine they're like cold sludge or clay just being molded in all of these different ways, or like one of those lights that like has one color slowly bleed into another color. But to be completely honest, I feel like some of the main melodies on this thing just sound kind of lame. And like when they're like the goddamn nucleus of an entire track, it can just make it feel so much more confined and boxed in and even border on actively grating. Like on Stepping Stone, it keeps like abruptly hitting notes in the higher register, and I guess I see how one could dig this groove. Like, it's pretty elastic and just bouncy like box springs, or I always picture like a rubber ball trapped in a box just like bouncing off all the walls. I don't know what the fuck this analogy is, but it feels right. But yeah, I just find it to be the most frustrating sound of all time, and that just kind of negates any of the cool details or progressions that the track had going for it. And what sucks is I actually feel like the progressions on this album are very well paced, and just layers are added and peeled back very naturally and effortlessly, but it's like every addition is just kind of there, like sitting at a surface level and never actually like enhancing anything or adding any momentum, and like entire tracks still manage to come across as totally flat. But one moment that I actually can't get over on this album is on the second track. It's just the way that those wavering synths sound. Like they have like an elegant glow about them, like reflective glass, or it's like they sound like all of the contents of a chandelier just like melting together and then like tipping over on their side and like pouring out in this very nauseating, stomach sinking kind of way. But yeah, overall I wasn't in love with this record, but I feel like if you're into electronic music, you should probably give it a shot because I could see a lot of people digging it. And next up, I want to cover the new Oval album, which has compositions that just are so cluttered. Like, it's like so many instruments on this record just feel like they're there because they can be, and just kind of go in one ear and out the other. And it just sounds super tangled in a way that's more headache-inducing than stimulating, and yeah, wasn't really a fan. But next up, I want to cover the new Owen Pallett album, which, to be frank, I've never listened to this guy's solo stuff in my life, but I think, from my understanding, this record continues a concept that he established, like, right at the start of his solo discography with Heartland. Like, I think overall this record's supposed to symbolize the destruction of a god that's been watching over him since then, but I didn't actually know that going in, and what stuck out to me the most about the lyrics is how they were talking about how, like, going through life romantically alone can kind of mean that you're constantly drowning in memories, and you have to be putting in so much effort to tread water, but they're pretty incessant and just can kind of cancel out any chance you had at enjoying solitude or comprehensive perspective on who you are. And yeah, they just tend to corrupt all of your inner peace. Like, I very much found this to be a theme on A Bloody Morning and Perseverance of the Saints and Transformer. And this track actually has my favorite line on this whole album, and that is, "I think I found the cure, just make sure you spend a quarter of your waking life in the present." Essentially, this just made me think about how, like, if this has happened to you enough, it can make you enter a near constant state of dissociation, especially since, like, every single time you return to being alone, you have more to dwell on. So it's just, like, you're experiencing all of your past all the time, and, like, it totally takes you over, and, like, really your only choice at this point is to just keep living for the rare hours you're actually with it and actively engaged in anything, and it's just kind of funny. And I also thought that Perseverance of the Saints capturing, like, the split seconds after you wake up in the morning was kind of clever, because it's like, at this point you can't really remember any of the specific features of your life, but what's going to come to you first is love and affection, and whether you have it, because you're in this especially vulnerable, childlike state. And in that moment, it's just like a very 0 or 100 kind of reaction dependent on that small detail of your life, which just kind of proves its significance to the human condition for me. And it's like, if you don't have it, you can feel, like, threatened or put on the spot in that split second, as if, like, there's the illusion of lack of safety or danger inside of your own body, or in you being alone. And the imagery on this record is just constantly reminding you of destruction and cataclysm and ruin. Like, A Bloody Morning uses this metaphor of a ship being tossed around in a storm to reflect his mental state, which I thought was pretty vivid. And on this track, I also dig the line, "Surely some disaster will descend and equalize us," because I feel like this suggests that sometimes we need these breakdowns because they're the only thing that'll ever truly wipe the slate clean on our lives. And then honestly, Fire Mayor really touched me for how it suggested, like, allowing yourself to be bitter over a failed relationship, but using the rage inside of you to just kind of set fire to their existence in your memory and replace it with this self-created calm. And the instrumentals on this record use acoustic guitars and pianos and pretty agile woodwinds and thin strings that feel like they could just be made of cloud matter or down feathers or something like that, and also sound slightly cinematic. And honestly, there isn't anything distinct or striking about these instrumentals, or really even remotely close. Like, they are very mild and restrained and have very direct structures and progressions, and I feel like your enjoyment of this record is just kind of going to come down to how willing you are to embrace that and just let the whole thing pacify you, because it is a really effortless listen. But they also have, like, this very bright, sparkling resonance about them, and so listening to this thing can just kind of feel like I'm rising out of the salty ocean and, like, a beam of light is just warming all of my skin or something. And I also very much feel that with the way that Paragon of Order begins, by, like, letting all of these shuddering strings just slowly disappear and revealing this single piano chord that just kind of drones through the whole track, and you, like, move with it the whole time, so it gives it a very suspended in air type feeling. And this track also has these very steady kicks and cymbals, and these two things do progress throughout, and you also have like strings and just these very simple rosy flutes kind of prancing through the track, but like the core of the instrumental still feels very like stable and still. And I feel like it helps that his voice kind of communicates the same and just has this effortless grace and strength about it, despite it also being full of sorrow and woe, and despite it just technically being a pretty unremarkable vocal. But yeah, I would say give this thing a quick shot. You might get something out of it, although I also could see you finding it kind of forgettable. But yeah, next up I want to cover this new Phoebe Bridgers record. I haven't always been in love with her voice, and I feel like it could have been a problem on this record because it's about as subdued as the instrumentals are. But honestly, like literally every other characteristic about this thing won me over, so it was never gonna be like a deal breaker. And after having come back to this record, I just feel like it's so much clearer how swollen with feeling she is, and how it's like she's constantly cowering into her own misery on this thing. And I don't know exactly how to explain this, but it's like her voice sounds so pale and soft and sweet that it kind of reminds me of like lavender or something. And it also has like a warmth to it, but simultaneously a cool masculinity, so it's like hot cold flashes or something. I find the intro to this record to be particularly effective. I feel like it sounds like Phoebe's in like a practice room and she just plugged in all her gear and she's just like hitting a couple notes on her guitar, and like the reverb on this track just contributes to the spaciousness to it, and it's just like the air feels really heavy and you're just sinking lower and lower into this aloneness, or maybe like the reality of life or something like that. And just in general, I love the guitar tones on this record. Like I feel like they sound so liquidy and just silky smooth. And I guess on the track Halloween, for example, though, they have this like dry, natural clack about them, which is also really satisfying. But like the instrumentals are always just so miniature. It's just like they're these petite little string webs or something like that. And I feel like every single one has something captivating about it, like maybe an instrumental garnish. Like on the track Garden Song, the way that the guitars sound like they're granulating or like crumbling into pixels in there or something. And I'm pretty sure either this effect or like a similar one is used in multiple points throughout this record, and I really like it, but I feel like in this case in particular, it's just a really tasteful decision to have that alone carry so much of the track, and it plays out exactly how she wanted it to. And I also really like whatever effect is in the title track that's making it sound like some kind of dry brush or like chalkiness is coming with the pianos as they move. And also like the vocal layer with the vocoder just sounds like bubbles like in the process of billowing out as you blow them or something like that. And I feel like the pianos on this track just sound like fireflies or like twinkling stars just circling around it, and it's just a gorgeous little track. And I also just really like the fact that she wrote a song about this, because I feel like the celebrity to fan relationship is just like an indisputable example of there being a disconnect between the levels of care from both people involved. And I just feel like these disconnects exist everywhere in all types of relationships, and are even in the places that you don't expect them to be. And admiration is one thing, but when someone happens to directly change the entire course your life takes, and they had no literal presence in the situation whatsoever, it can feel really intense. And I also fixated on the part of this track where she was realizing that she can't even expect that much out of the people she loves, because she can't give the people she doesn't love equally that basic care. I feel like reflecting on something like this can really just make you feel like a piece of shit, and like no one's equally giving and receiving, and you're just another part of the problem. And I love how Garden Song suggests like she lost track of how much she was growing and improving, and now something's making her realize all at once that yeah, she actually does have a lot behind her. Because I just feel like that is something that you anticipate happening for so long, and then when it finally does, it can almost feel too good to be true. And it's like you finally find the ability to respect your past self for having just jumped all in on something, and you realize that in you doing that and in your determination, improvement was always going to come about as automatically as like your physical features maturing. And I also really love how on this track she's suggesting that she now feels able to just give all of herself to the exact right person too, because it's like, ain't that the dream? But then on the contrary, you have like this verse on Chinese Satellite, for example, where she's talking about how, like, even if you think you know exactly what you want and you're working towards it, once you're far in enough and you're rapidly moving in that direction, like, there is so much room to doubt it and for what you want to just automatically become anything but that. And on this track, I also love the line, drowning out the morning birds with the same 3 songs over and over, because I just feel like this is a really smart detail to fixate on, because it's true that, like, your brain just relentlessly tries to avoid absorption in literally anything and just reach instant pleasure in any way that it can. And I feel like if you're depressed, that can get that much worse, and your entire life can just start to feel like a constant fight to avoid that. And there was also an interview that I read where Phoebe said that on this track she was referencing, like, how she has no specific faith per se, but it just seems like everything could just flip around and actually be a lot more magical than it is, but just as easily, like, everything in the world could be about as nothing as it seems. Like, when I read that, I was just like, Phoebe Bridgers, that is the most accurate fucking thing you have ever said. And in terms of the instrumental to this track, I really like how in the chorus there's no instrumentation except strings. It's just like there's a lot more emphasis on the sorrow behind this track because she made this move. And then it's always just like crashing back in head first with more instruments like drums and additional guitars. And it feels like at some point this track just can't properly control or organize the amount of emotion it has pent up. And I also kind of feel that way in how there's like a trail of fog behind her vocals at some point. Like, it's just very like, whoa, what's happening? But I just feel like something with this amount of reckless force and impetus about it is especially convincing in a record like this. And I also love the instrumental behind I See You and how there are like these palpitating pianos in there followed by vocals and drums. Like, it just feels like a trail of just sparkly fairy dust in the track or something. And it's just like chills or a tingly sensation just rising in your body and like hitting a peak. And it just really maintains that propulsive feeling for the whole way through. And I also really like the cut Savior Complex for how Phoebe's talking about like connecting with someone by sharing in her pain with them, but then knowing moving forward, like, it's just gonna be like, I care about you so much, but all we're ever ultimately gonna do is just like spawn hell together. I just feel like the danger to this situation and how cornered she feels is really tangible in the songwriting. And I also love the track Graceland too, mostly for how it communicates the same level of just excessive admiration you would have for like someone you're in love with, but it's really just about her platonic close friends. So it's like pure empathy, but it comes across as so sincere. And I feel like country is just the perfect thing to influence the instrumental, and the banjo and the strings just sway so sentimentally in this track. And I guess it just struck me how much emphasis she was putting on how this person struggling doesn't even realize how powerful they are when they're mentally well, and now that they are, they can harness it. And I really love I Know the End as the closing statement to this record. I see this as her getting home and realizing the aloneness that she felt way back in the day, or even just before tour, will likely follow her forever. It's frustrating. It's just like the ultimate problem that will never be solved. And it's like sometimes it just seems impossible that you'll ever get through to the right people. That's why it makes sense to romanticize a quiet life and what you can do working and thinking by yourself. And it just seems like there's an unignorable amount of truth and importance to feeling this way, and it's probably that much more prevalent in the air for her because she's in this place, and everyone she was used to seeing here has now moved on, and it's all irrelevant to them. And even just having depression kind of means there's this constant heavy silence around you, and you just get the sense that the world could just crash in at any second. And then add on the fact that this track's also about like the projected end of all civilization brought on by human beings, and it's like you're tripling up on that feeling. And yeah, there's just a ton of imagery on this track. It's hella scenic and everything's just disarrayed, or it'll just directly imply consumerism, which obviously is moving us in that direction. But yeah, overall I felt like this record had some really sophisticated songwriting and just pleasantly dainty production and sweetly despaired vocal performances, and I was sold on it pretty easily, so I would definitely check it out. And next up, I want to cover the new album by the band Pinegrove. This band is just such a, like, band next door type band. Like, sometimes when I'm listening to them, I just feel like I'm hearing, like, a practice session in a basement or something. But what really makes them work for me is the fact that the lead singer Evan's vocals just feel like they're softening the inside of me into dough or something like that. Like, he is just sopping with ache and just accesses such a deep crevice of my heart so instantly and directly with, like, the most effortless touch. And what carries that same vulnerability is the instrumentals. Like I said, they have that pleasantly shabby recording quality about them, and I feel like the guitars sound quite breakable and brittle. And Evan sounds a lot warmer and riper with feeling and quite boyish, so I feel like he is exactly what makes these dingy tones feel almost toasty and thermal, like they're a part of a bonfire. And these instrumentals also have like an alt country twist to them, and honestly just feel way too comfortable to listen to. Like, I feel like I'm wearing an old sweater and like sipping tea or some bullshit when I listen to this. Or actually, I could compare the feeling to actually being able to feel the start of fall as a new beginning instead of just like more time passing through you and everything feeling exactly how it should have felt from the beginning for once. And on a lot of these tracks, it seems like Evan is reflecting on some kind of failed relationship and is still really sore, but starting to gain some perspective on the situation and almost like apologizing for having expected more than he had a right to expect and subconsciously thinking everything would just work out in this special way for him. And I feel like the very unassuming humdrum quality about the instrumentals reflects that. And that feeling that something's been lost is especially prominent on a track like Alcove, for example. Just by the way the track's written in such simple terms, as if he doesn't really have anything left to say except, you know what, it's fine, I'll just do the noble thing and remove myself from this space in order to save both you and myself. And the way that he puts so much emphasis on every note on this track is just gut-wrenching. And there are actually quite a few lyrical moments on this thing that hold sentimental value to me now. Like, on Dotted Line, the way that he's saying, like, may no pipe dream ever ruin or outright try to rescue me, and may all that I've lost never affect the present, and just allow this to be the blueprint to my life moving forward because that's what I deserve. And I really loved how on Endless he was saying, just very simply, like, the days may seem endless and futile, but they're not, and ultimately I'm grateful for them. And the way that I read Neighbor, the opossum was supposed to represent how he's not able to be there for this person when she needs, and the bug was supposed to represent how she's still able to try so hard for him, and just him not understanding that, or really his lover's mannerisms in general, and not thinking that it's worth it to pull her away from everything and everyone else in the world if he can't even get there. And the lyric, a ray shines out of her mouth and points back to nature, I love that bird but I don't ever want to take her, just kind of shows them wrapping everything up and being like, alright, that was wild, but it's time to get real and go back to our natural states. And I think it's perfect how this transitions into the last track, where you just have these like guitars that sound like they're just swaying in the wind and these vaguely mournful droning guitars underneath that. Another takeaway from this record for me was Moment. I just feel like this perfectly communicates having that gut feeling that just everything in your chest is about to drop when you hear some harsh truth. And I feel like the way that Evan's just yelping slightly and drawing out specific notes, and the way the drums just pummel down at that part, means that you can really feel the tension, and the way he's just suspended in that moment and just like, oh my fucking god, put me out of my misery. But yeah, I feel like this is not the fullest sounding album. It doesn't have a ton of meat on its bones, but it's very sincere and it's unassuming but pretty, so I would say give it a shot. Alright guys, we've finally made it to the entire point of this video, and that's Purple Moonlight Pages by R.A.P. Ferreira. I feel like with any Milo project you're gonna get a certain amount of earnest, scholarly contemplation, but at the same time there's never a moment that he doesn't come across as personable, and his delivery, and to some extent his words as well, just make him sound completely loopy and clocked out and in the clouds. And I think it is that balance that I'm so infatuated with, because it's like despite his absent-minded tendencies and his brain just kind of idling all the time, like, when he's invested in something, he can achieve this laser-sharp concentration, and I feel like this can only come from someone who's just compulsively theorizing over everything all the time, and I also feel like there's a certain amount of honesty to him showing that side of him on purpose as, like, an artistic decision. It just means that consuming his stuff, you're a little bit more like, yeah, I get Milo. And ultimately, like, that's how you arrive at thoughts that are this hyper-specific crossroad between abstract and intellectual, and, like, his lyricism is just, like, these intricately convoluted labyrinths of weirdo shit where words are just, like, shoved in and tripping over themselves. And topically, I feel like this record is, of course, a lot less nerdy and referential than he was in his earlier days, but it's also a lot less philosophical than his last few, and more often it's just blatantly reflecting on the process of making fine art and the sheer beauty and warmth to it, but the setbacks and struggles to maintain it alike. And for me, it's just always really nice to hear him directly addressing it in this way, because one of the things that's always really stuck with me about Milo is how he's referenced stress as the number one antagonist to his piece and the number one motivating factor in his life. So him taking all of it and putting it into creating something remedial and still comprehensively being so optimistic about it and holding it on the highest plane of respect and getting sentimental over it is just really fucking inspiring. And on top of that, I feel like he sounds about as healthy and enlightened as he's ever sounded on a project. He has a good ass head on his shoulders, and he also just sounds totally confident and autonomous on this thing. Like, he sounds completely assured of the magnitude of his words and how essentially out of thin air and sheer willpower he's just creating this substantive utopia for himself. Like, that changes how it's received 100%. And another one of my favorite things about his lyricism is how I can look at and digest the same thing I already have, or he'll come out with a new project and I'll just get the illusion that he's saturated himself in a totally fresh array of vocabulary and concepts, and that's probably just because it's so goddamn complex and voluminous, but yeah, and the language on this thing strikes me as especially succulent, and the instrumentals have like this sweet jazz thing going on, and the beats are really vibrant and resonant and just feel like being surrounded by fresh air and saturated colors, and it kind of reflects that mental clarity that I was talking about. They're like these tightly assembled, sturdy platforms just standing as words up, and I feel like the way that these live percussive smacks are used contributes to that. Like, just take the track Greens, for example, where like the kick and the snare is just slapped down, and then you have these jingles that also kind of contribute to it just feeling very upright and like it's moving in a vertical direction. And I also really like it when a beat on this project coincides with a lyrical sentiment. Like, I'm pretty sure Non-Cypher is about setbacks, and I just feel like the frisky sax spurts and his vocal delivery really kind of feels like a reaction to that. Or like on the track Doldrums, for example, you have this glum, bare-skinned jazz beat, and it just feels like the entire world has become drab, or like a muted or faded tone, or you're like looking out your window and there's like a light rain coming down, and I feel like that totally coincides with this idea that through his eyes the process of making art can be prone to just looking about as plain as everything else in the world, and when you implement everyday conventions or routines into art, or your head is just fixed into this tiny little perspective to try to improve, like, you're ultimately dulling beauty. And I guess he's just questioning whether he should be focusing mostly on that when he's reflecting on the whole thing, or like how possible it is to step outside of his own perspective and see all the depth and the spiritual quality that still exists inside of it. And I really like how the track Cycles uses these guitars that have like a languid sway about them and just sound shamelessly tear-jerking and sentimental, and how, like, even though the track gets slightly esoteric, just by the way that sentences are structured and contextually, it's ultimately unusually followable and coherent for Milo's standards, and that just makes me feel like he's doing whatever he needs to be 100% sure that he's getting through with this simple message that art is ultimately the most pure and honest thing in the world, but it's very obvious where and why it goes wrong, and you can pinpoint exactly why walls are going to stay up between you and what you want. And I guess just this simplicity is also nice after tracks like Greens and Omens and Totems draw out and convolute similar concepts in a good way. And on the track Dust Up, I feel like the beat just sounds like you're in this abyss with dust blowing through it, and there are also just these stomach dropping chords in there. And I believe like the beginning of this track is covering how when you're isolated you gain this new perspective on how nothing in your mind is that natural, period, and really the only thing giving you stability or security is what you're surrounded by. And it's also just capturing a moment on an average day of the grind where his head's trailing off course and it's just depleted, and trying to make coherent art with either of these things working against you can just kind of feel like you're staring at this sea of like weird half-developed thoughts and images and just trying to clench hold of the exact right things before they slip away, but like you can barely see and you're just like dizzy as fuck. And where he said brought a broom to a dust up, I thought he was suggesting that really the only thing that you can do to get yourself out of this mental vacuum is going to take effort. So just kind of like get up, get a broom, and start sweeping. And if that whole thing was more dissociative and just about memories swallowing up the present, I like how he said that, like, this is really the only thing that gives me a chance to step outside of my own mind, because that's really the whole point anyway. And, where he said, I hope to only ever be utilized and in service of another's journey. I didn't necessarily think he was saying he's gonna directly help these whack motherfuckers, but more just that he wants his stuff to have like a ripple effect and like assist those who have it in them to create something substantial and just kind of pass through those who never did. And then I think my favorite instrumental on this thing is on Omens and Totems. I just love like that flux of synthetic string with the soft buzz kissing it and those spectral synth chords. And I also really like how on this track he says, like, most people try to delete their blues and with it most of life, and just give me space to wave my arms around, because I took this as him saying, like, I'm not gonna believe there's anything closer to a grand solution to life than just being able to acknowledge the full range of darks and lights inside of me. And I also love how on this track he says that the greatest artists are always apprentices, because they have the purest fire and the greatest understanding of the importance of work ethic and the most even natural balance of successes and failures to reflect on. And I feel like with enough stature, once you're at like professional standing, you can kind of start to think that you're above setbacks or self-reflection, and your perspective just really narrows, and it just seems like you would be rarely inspired like that. And then on an idea as a work of art, I don't know if this is just me, but I was taking a lot of the language in Ferreira's verse to imply like using an irresponsibly high level of passion and energy to try to build better answers to destructive questions. But then where he says, like, until we meet again at the Comfort Inn, I thought he was sort of reminding you, like, there'll be a point that your allostatic load right now is just completely released and irrelevant, and inevitably it's so hard to know what the hell you're even trying to do when you're creating anyway, and you're gonna lose that objective eventually. And our priorities are constantly feeling the need to change too. Like, it's almost like he's making fun of how little our bodies and minds can actually handle here, but the point is, the idea of this should give you solace and drive in moments of peak stress. And then, of course, Laundry is a stunner in the track list. I just love the idea of like a dude with a reputation this complex and intellectual just finding such a non-serious, everyday, intimate moment worth writing a whole song about. And I love how the spurts of jovial pianos just frame it all to sound so playful and feel good. And of course, the hot like clothes in the dryer and the turntablism just really like make it seem that much more dope. And it's like, how do you not eat this up? It's just like the most effectively Milo thing I've ever heard, and moments like this are exactly what makes the project so appealing. So yeah, this upgraded version of Milo gets 2 big ass thumbs up from me, and please listen to this guy's genius if you have not already. Next up, I want to cover the new Real project. This thing is just peak hectic, hyperactive, exuberant. It's majority electro house, but I think there's also some trap and future bass going on here. And then let's see, this project uses all of these blade sharp synthetics, or just like synthetics that feel really snappy and crisp, like they could be hitting a marble floor. It has all of these whimsical chipper melodies, a couple flutes and whistles in there. It's constantly zapping you with all of these like quick sound effects. It uses a fair amount of sub bass and 808s, but then like track 10, for example, has this bouncy analog bass to it that I really like. So essentially just a whole range of different timbres and inflections. And I think the most noticeable thing about this is how like it's so melodically focused, but then on top of that, each individual one has such a loud personality about it. And each track has chunks that might call to like a different style or a drastically different feeling. So it's just like you're on a roller coaster being jerked in every direction, but it comes together pretty freaking well. And the production on this thing can be really excessively peppy and jaunty, but then just do like a complete 180 and start to have like a devilish sneer to it, like on the track Insider, or like the way that she's flowing and certain inflections she has on hype mode in track 8. And that one actually has like both of these things going on at once, so it's almost like it's fakely cheery to the point where it's menacing. And I'm similarly intimidated by the maniac circus-like energy at the start of track 3. I think my favorite cut on here is track 5, which is like this electro pop, maybe dance pop type thing. And I swear to God, if you could smell this track, it would smell like a department store in the mall. So you're just getting like these atmospheric whiffs of that, and then these scents that feel like they could be made of like dried shellac nail polish and a chirpy flute. Then towards the end there's this daunting breakbeat that just makes the track sound like it's tumbling straight into a ditch, but simultaneously there are these clear as fuck synthetic swirls around it which just make it all feel weirdly surreal. But yeah, this project is hella flashy and electrifying, and I think my only issue with it really is just that it can feel like it's kind of splashing around on a surface level rather than truly penetrating and staying, but I recommend just downing shots of espresso before you listen to it because you'll likely enjoy it more. And next up, I want to cover this new Rina Sawayama. I really like how on this project she chose stylistic influences, specifically that we're going to play to how over the top it is in a sarcastic way, like nu metal and pop punk and the strain of rock. She's just toying with so much at once on this thing that it actually feels like its main purpose as a whole statement is just to show that like she can make anything work, and any and every setback would just bounce straight off of her, so she's gonna do whatever she wants. It's just one big ridiculous, bordering on ostentatious fuck you. And I feel like anywhere where there's riffage, you can really sense that hard-headed determination to just achieve world fucking domination or invincibility. And even just the fact that this is a glamorous pop album means that like it has an empowering quality to it by default. And then of course her vocal performances just have peak attitude and melodrama about them, so like this is some diva shit. And like the instrumentals have a cinematic quality to them, so it's like her life's a movie. I love Excess for how its lyrics just suggest unapologetically bathing in your wealth, or just being excessive in whatever you do and having a strong personality, because it's like you're alive, you may as well fuck it up the ass, right? And I just feel like this track has the most perfect sassy vocal performance and fluid strums and bouncy percussive pops, and then of course like that nu metal fist just kind of sweeps in and knocks you out because it's so immediately max in the mix. And I feel like the brawny nu metal riffs on Shut the Fuck Up just make me feel like I'm straight up at an auto race and there's like dirt flying up from car tires everywhere and shit. But then like the chorus just has these cheery synth chords and guitars, and it just feels like this part is like raining glitter. And I just find it kind of interesting how like what's making this clashing sparkle and grit work so well and agree is just how Rina's commanding it with such a sheer lack of fucks. Like you have her taunting little delivery in the chorus and just that maniac laughter that kicks the whole thing off. And I just love how like on this track she's literally making no statement except I think you should shut the fuck up. and like it's only working because she's fucking Rina Sawayama, you know what I mean? And I also love the track Akasaka Sad, and how the bass just sounds like it's being dunked into the production, and like those slinky synths that move from left to right. And I'm sorry, just like the way that she pairs Akasaka with sad and Sawayama is so satisfying, and these word combinations just like roll off the tongue so slickly, so I feel like it's really smart to have them be such a big part of the chorus, and just keeps me coming back to the track. And I love how like this track and Dynasty are making her pain surrounding her upbringing and her heritage all big and melodramatic without taking away from the sincerity behind it. And I feel like Dynasty is that much more intense because it sounds like there's this white heavenly light surrounding the beginning, and the bells just have this divine command about them. And I feel like that's probably why I like it so much when this album uses those, and it does quite a bit. And when it comes to Bad Friend and Chosen Family, like, my problem is not the fact that the messages have so much meaning behind them, because I think this record has like a lot of sincerity to it, but it's more just how like Rina sounds like she's trying to send the most fateful, profound message of all time. Like, it's just a total 180 from anything remotely tongue-in-cheek, and the instrumentals don't help. Like, Chosen Family is this ballad type track, and like the drums sound like they're trying to replicate being able to hear your every heartbeat. And of course her performance on this track is just so weighty and has a colossal amount of emotion to it. And I also just hate the way the synths sound on this track. Like, I feel like there's something that would play with like a cheap robot animation you would watch in grade school. Like, I don't think I can explain it in a better way than that. But yeah, ultimately I just don't feel like Chosen Family or Bad Friend really flow with the track list at all. And I think Comme des Garçons is a decent song on its own, but just the fact that it's centered around this catwalk-ready bass line makes it feel pretty alien to the track list for me as well. And I feel like I know why she approached Paradise in the way that she did, because its sarcastically chipper quality definitely makes it fit in, but like, I just hate the way it sounds. Like, it's pretty pop punk, so that's kind of a dead giveaway, but also just like, I hate those spritzy synths and the chorus on this track. But I do kind of think it's cool how on this track she's making fun of her rambunctious thoughts and priorities at age 15, and you're gonna hear a lot about her upbringing on this thing, so that is one consistent characteristic that it has. But ultimately this thing is pretty all over the place and can be quite abrupt and confusing and even unfulfilling, but there are high highs, so just go in curious and expect some fucking ruckus. And next up I want to cover RTJ4. I feel like the instrumentals on this record just have an overblown amount of tenacity and determination about them. Like, it sounds intensely concentrated in a critical moment. It's like you're just racing to the portal before the clock runs out in a movie or something like that. And in the lowest of low-key ways, I feel like some of the beats like channel a reaction similar to the sound of every alarm in a building going off, or just seem to like signal uprising in a way. And there's also this tension holding all of the instruments together in this thing, so it's like they're jerked in there very tightly, and because of that, like, sometimes it feels like instruments are just being like heaved out from a burning chest or throat or something like that. Like, definitely very much get that from the vocals on Out of Sight. And I feel like moments like this and the low ends on this thing just really like channel a physical reaction from a deep part of your chest and seems to just bang against it. So there's definitely a meaty callousness and cold-bloodedness about the beats themselves, but I also just feel like Killer Mike and LP sound about as barbaric and hungry as they've ever sounded, and their intimidating amount of technical prowess definitely contributes to that. Like, dude, their flows and lyricism and rhyme schemes are always just directly on point, hitting the bullseye every time and just leaving smoke on the table. And I feel like Yankee and the Brave is an incredible way to just shock you into the record, and I really like how Killer Mike and LP's flows just complement that wall of drums and the alarms in the beat. It's just like the track feels like you just walked into the room and like everything's on fire and you're like, oh shit. And I also dig how in his verse LP kind of pokes fun at Killer Mike in an endearing way, because I feel like it both lightens the moment and speaks to the value of camaraderie in the situation. And I like how Unholy Calamifuck, L's like, yeah, reality sucks dick, so our solution is to get high on some DMT. And then after he's hypothetically tripping, he informs the Time Elves that, hey, little guy, just walking through from another timeline where monsters ate truth, because I feel like the fact that this is who he's talking to plays to the utter ridiculousness of the situation, and in itself suggests, like, anything and anyone from the outside would just see how fucking astounding and ridiculous this all is, and I feel like that's not something we acknowledge all the time. And then I think it's really effective how on this track, out of these intimidating xylophone or marimba clangs, I can't really tell which instrument it is, this thick bass slides out and it just feels like you're descending into the dark depths of the earth, and there are these doom-struck chords in there and hi-hats that are falling under and twisting very tightly like gears as they do. And another sick moment on this record for me is the way that the track Goonies is topped off, because there are all these progressions to the beat right at the tail end, and also Killer Mike's flow picks up some speed and just slides into all these switches, so it's really just out with a bang. And on Just, Pharrell sounds so just like smooth and unbothered in the pre-chorus. Like it's almost like he has this quietly judging tone and he's just like sipping tea and raising his eyebrow a little bit, but simultaneously he actually has the coldest arrangement of words on the whole record in my opinion. And like I love this part in particular, but I also just think the whole track is a really effective tonal outlier for the album. I thought Walking in the Snow was kind of a lyrical gem all around, and LP's bars starting with "cages aren't just built for one group" definitely caught my attention, because I thought that he was getting at the fact that tons of socioeconomic variables can leave you disadvantaged, and there's always a power structure, so if you're not at the top, you're targeted or exploited in one way or another. And I thought Killer Mike was kind of playing off of that by saying, like, you can think that you're excluded from this oppressed demographic and just kind of offer your empty condolences, but ultimately tell us it's a you problem. But what's funny is there might come a day that the system fucks you really bad too, so not standing with people of color right now just doesn't even make sense. And like, it's just sad how if you are black, everything that you're disadvantaged in is interconnected and just reinforcing everything else. And I really like how Killer Mike's verse on this thing is just right on the nose and has no ambiguity about it whatsoever, because I do think there's a fair amount of that on this album, so it means it really glows with importance on this thing. And on the track Pulling the Pin, I thought it was pretty cool how LP used the phrase self-lobotomy to suggest how, like, he subconsciously just desperately tried to desensitize himself to this issue because it's just too heavy to fully grasp. But now, like, everything's just starting to come back into light for a moment, and it's like, oh my god. And I like how on this track he also reminded us how, like, this entire thing can't be contained in just one dollop, or, like, one wave of progress is kind of just a fucking blip in the grand scheme of this issue. And how Killer Mike says, like, quite literally, this is just a good versus evil thing at this point. Like, it's a question of ethics and morality, and he imagines the fight taking place in, like, a spiritual realm. And the line, "I promised my mama I would stay honest, but I want it all in the physical," stuck with me because, like, I feel like it emphasizes how difficult it can be to control your natural emotional response and your rage at this situation. Like, it's just a very human moment. And I think the only thing that really bothered me on this whole record is just how the sample is used in Ooh La La's chorus, because it just feels like a really random thing to, like, fixate on and loop, and just feels really abrupt in the track and leaves me feeling perplexed and not much more. But, like, I guess there's nothing explicitly wrong with the rest of it. And I do think some beats go harder than others on this thing. Like, I'm not crazy about the approach to Never Look Back, and the writing does lean kind of ambiguous, but none of it is, like, explicitly unflattering. And assuming you like hardcore hip-hop, like, there are a lot of selling points to this record. I can't really see why you would dislike it. So yeah. Next up, I want to cover briefly this Serpent with Feet, like, singles pack, mostly for the track Psychic. Like, it's pretty decent the whole way through, but this track is something that I can, like, actually fixate on in it. I like how this thing sort of portrays the idea of, like, falling in love with a psychic, or I guess just someone with, like, a certain wisdom about them, or just, like, a mystical quality about their mind that you can't quite pinpoint. And I feel like the way the vocals and pianos move reflects how they could just pull you into their gaze in this effortless hypnosis, and they just sound irresistibly eerie, and it's a very foreign type of eerie. Like, they almost have an occult kind of quality to them, and it's just like the whole track is churning and swirling around in a cauldron. So yeah, that's my one takeaway from this thing, but if you like this guy's work, I can't see this not working for you, so it's only 8 minutes, give it a shot. Next up, I'm trying to cover the new Sewer Slut. I don't know if it's just me, but so many melodies at the heart of these tracks just seem blandly arranged, like with the vocals in the second half of Mr. Kill Myself, or even the dance groove on Lexapro and even the bass can sound kind of obnoxious on this thing, because like one note will just drone on for an excessively long time, like with the tracks Lexapro or Esophagus, for example. And the pads do have a wide surface area and inundate tracks and make them feel like full body experiences and give them this slight mistiness and make you feel like it just rained or you just took a shower or you're like in a sauna or something like that. But my problem with them lies in their core timbre. Like, I feel like they sound a bit thin and undertreated and dime a dozen and don't really inspire truly vivid or detailed description out of me. And I have the same issue with the break beats. Like, these just sound dead on to what you would expect. And a lot of the time the patterns aren't stimulating enough to make up for it, or they just get a bit too repetitive and lose power at a certain point, like on the track Esophagus. But they can have this full throttle head spinning turbulence about them, like on the track Mr. Kill Myself, where they have this breakneck tempo and the cymbal and snare thuds very much sound like you're just hitting your face on concrete repeatedly or like being stampeded or trampled over. And simultaneously this track has like this drone that just sounds like it's swallowing you up into the sun or the ether or something. And there's also this bass that sounds very wet and it's just like it's splattering or like being plunged into the track. Actually, the track Yandir Complex has something similar, but it also has like these pitched, severed human voices that are arranged to sound like they're gargling, and I feel like these are some of the most invigorating sounds on the record for me. But also, like, I just have to mention that this record's whole artistic identity just feels really fucking weird to me, because it's like the whole presentation and setup, from the song titles to the suicidal vocal snippets, feel completely irrelevant from the way it sounds, and like there's no statement being made here. Like, the only part of it that I could really see coinciding with that is the fact that the ambiance sometimes does feel kind of stuffy, and then like that along with the clearly internet core aspects of this just kind of remind me of like spending way too much fucking time in your room. But yeah, I guess if this were like better implemented into it, I could guess that Sewer Slut's trying to replicate the type of high that a suicidal person might experience, or say that like keeping the thought of killing yourself around is like a rush, because yeah, this record really is just like straight adrenaline the whole way through. It's unrelenting, and I think my problem is just that I get a very similar gut reaction to every track, because the actual effect to the breakbeats and the synths and the vocals stays pretty static, and there's not enough unique spark to the arrangements to really break it out of that. But next up, I want to cover the new Shy project, which I like much better. It feels like this thing is just full of like little lullabies. It has a childlike innocence about it, and definitely a very healing, alleviating quality, and it's really dainty. The instruments just scintillate very delicately and just like dance along your skin lightly, and the physical effect is akin to like a bug's legs landing on your arm or something. It's barely there. The melodies can occasionally feel like they're just spilling into these slackened, free-flowing instrument swarms, but most of the time there's a pretty well-defined balance of the two. And I think my favorite track on this thing is Firefly. I just love like those tight rattling synths that kind of remind me of a marble bouncing on wood, and I think the way that those more naked pianos carry it to finish is just absolutely beautiful. And probably both because of the field recording it starts off with and because of the forlorn weight the pianos carry, the track just kind of feels like falling into this empty oblivion or obscurity or like a heavy silence. This is a lovely little record. I would say if you're interested, like, you should hit it up on Bandcamp and buy it, because by doing so you're supporting an independent artist and a really talented one. I'll leave a link in the description. And next up, I want to cover this new Sign Libra project. As you may be able to tell, the sea references are fucking inescapable on this thing, so it's very hard to avoid like sea related images just saturating my head in a listen to this album. And I promise you, the first time you hear this, just a million timbres and tones are gonna get you excited and tickle your fucking fancy and get you all hot and bothered. They almost have like a gaudiness to them, or at least a frivolity, because like a lot of MIDI instruments are used which only sound sophisticated contextually, and like here and there you're gonna get glistening like preset or stock akin timbres, and I feel like those play to the way that this can feel like you're at this perfectly pampered sea resort or just somewhere unrealistically utopic, or like the spiritual or Empyrean glow that it has. And this record also feels super otherworldly, and just like all time is blending together at points, and like it kind of makes me feel similar to how I feel like flashing back to my childhood. Like that shit feels way too simple. It's like it didn't even happen, but it did. And I feel like if these two worlds are meeting, maybe it's like you're just flashing back to a trip to the beach with your family or some shit, I don't know. But I feel like she definitely has this just like freely, innocently explorative and naturally curious quality about the way that she creates. And I feel like a lot of the instruments just sound like they're cruising along free of worry and have this whimsicality about them, which complements that. And I could just imagine this album taking place in like the tropics at midday. Some of the percussive taps literally sound like drips or something small being dunked into and puncturing water. Some of the woodwinds and especially the vocal pads have this texture that reminds me of like sand being blown in the wind at the beach. Like the first track definitely has that going on with its vocal pads, and I don't know what it is, but whenever I listen to this thing, I always just picture like a choir of gnomes on the shore, and as each one comes in with their part, it like lights up a part of the track and it just totally covers you. And I feel like a lot of this album sounds like it's just baptizing you completely, and that's probably due to the reverb and just the cavernous space and depth about it. I also feel like there's just this darkness about this record that feels kind of inexplicable, so it's a little bit intimidating and like daunting in a sense. But one thing that I can actually pinpoint that makes me feel this way is the ritualistic whispers on Serenity. Like this is some cult chant shit, or maybe it's something more diabolical and it's like she's summoning fiends. I don't know, she just sounds possessed. And on a couple tracks, I just feel like I'm being surrounded by like deep sea organisms, or maybe it's like I've stumbled on like this grotesque, unclassified species, and like the rhythm makes me feel like it's just like slowly creeping up on me in a stalk, like on the track Serenity and Tranquility, and the creature's probably like vaguely crab-like. Dear God, I need a fucking lesson in marine biology just to describe this shit. But overall, I feel like this record almost evokes the range of sensations you would get in like different depths of the sea. So like you have the freakish, nightmarish shit all the way at the bottom, like I said, where like everything's filled with muck and you get the sensation that seaweed's just brushing along your leg. And then you have everything all the way up to the surface where like the instruments are much more cleansing and rejuvenating, and you're just floating in the photic zone, and like the vitamin D is giving you a rush of serotonin. And in terms of highlights on this thing, I love Sea of Islands. It makes me feel like I'm playing Yoshi's Island or like some tropical course in a game in the Mario franchise. I feel like it could be a part of a soundtrack, and that low-key we should petition for that to happen. But it's mostly just based on the whimsicality to every melody here, but especially the one it starts off with. I think this is a synthetic woodwind of some sort, and it very much sounds like something's just gone right. Like maybe you just got a boost or an item or something like that. And I also dig the track Sea of Cleverness, which has like this stretched whistle that just makes me feel like I'm falling out of order, or I just inhaled a bunch of helium and now I'm all lightheaded and loopy. And this track also has a sick progression about it, because towards the end this rhythmic beat kicks in and this reverb heavy percussive fuzz is curt in there but has crushing impact. And there's also this high-pitched woodwind that just sounds like a butterfly taking flight simultaneously. And both of these things just have such a sense of determination and momentum about them and really just push the track through to the end. And I also really like the closer, which has like this vaguely 8-bitty synth melody and then just all these gorgeous arpeggios in the second half, which just straight up sound like liquid being like fluidly pulled apart or unrolling and then just dressing the track. And I also really like Sea of Waves, mostly for how, like, at each slight touch of that stringed instrument, just these sparkling trails follow it. And yeah, love this record. I feel like it kind of sounds like you're in a virtual world and you're simultaneously, like, beside the sea. Maybe you're going on a sea expedition of some sort, and it channels a childlike mysticism in me. Simultaneously kind of sounds like it's controlled by a divine entity, and it's also clearly inspired by cosmology. Like, there's just so much cool shit going on here, so I definitely recommend you hear it. And next up, I want to cover the new Squarepusher album. 90s drum and bass enthusiasts, this one's for you. He's back with his hyper-driven, antagonistic drum programming that just sounds like it's battering you to death, and these compositions that sound dangerously close to blowout. This is just one of those records that's really going to activate and work out the left side of your brain as you try to pinpoint why it sounds like it's trying to offset or bend its wiring. It uses this classic analog synth work as well, with that acid techno tone about it and a rubbery, bouncy recoil, sometimes like a liquid splatter. Simultaneously, I feel like it sounds like it's just like taking the pixels from an arcade game, like maybe Frogger, and just rearranging them into these gnarled, abstract patterns. But here's the thing. While I think this is doing what it's doing adequately and proficiently, like, because it's been done before, it's really easy for it to just slip your mind once you're kind of done listening to it and you have some distance away from it. And just when you think about it, like, it's such a lame artistic decision to make, to more or less just rework what you already excelled at like 20 years prior. And it is frustrating to me that like these two opinions are just pulling me toward polar opposite conclusions, and I wish I could just kind of appreciate this for what it is good at, but ultimately, yeah, I do kind of feel like this is exactly how you just waste raw skill, and in this case, expertise. And also, I feel like this record's layout is really stiff and awkward, because like you have these chunks of substance and then you have these breaks, like one directly in the middle and one directly at the end, and they just feel like they were approached to be like the designated interlude tracks for the purpose of being interludes, and they just sound impressively lame. Like, the most basic pads ever are used on Detroit Mover, and the last track just has a really awkward arrangement. And I also just feel like they're way too reserved to sound comfortable in this album. Like, you can't fall all the way back down to this after just straight mayhem. It's like you're at 100 and then you're all the way down to 0 and then you're at 100 again. And I feel like at best this project is listenable and a bit stimulating, but ultimately it's just kind of like a weak artistic statement. But you decide how much weight that actually carries for you. And next up, I want to cover this new Sufjan Stevens Lowell Brams collab project, Aporia. It's just that the flow of this album feels very minimally considered, and so many tracks just feel like scraps or loose ends or placeholders, and the main thing that sticks with me about it is just how recklessly scattered it all is. But the main reason why I don't hate it is because I find it very difficult to hate ambient music, and just the way it sounds so celestial and glides over your ears so effortlessly, combined with just how loose and exploratory it is, can kind of make it feel like a brain rinse in a sense. And I do feel like all of this sanctity and divinity lies in what it takes. Like, this track is actually fucking moving, and it just feels like a totally full body experience and just engulfs all of the inside of you. And in the drums there are like some kicks and then some snares, and then the hi-hats are like this motion blur surrounding everything, so they kind of make it feel like an ombre pattern or something like that. And this is one of many tracks on this thing that makes me feel like I'm watching a nature documentary, and for whatever reason, specifically one in the Savannah Desert. I don't know why for me it's like more this biome than any other one, but maybe it has to do with like the heat or like the idea of just watching the world dry out. But I'm always thinking of like an intense trek across the desert as you're like dying of dehydration. Or animals are, you know, do animals dehydrate? Well, they're probably adapted to the climate. Regardless, it's certainly a very vast and scenic and environmental type of experience, and it's also very film score-esque, which of course was intentional. And next up, I want to cover the new Tame Impala, The Slow Rush. I'm not against this record in theory, you know, like I'm cool with these 70s soft rock, yacht rock, vintage psych pop grooves, and I guess in some sense the bright resonance about the instruments and the floppy congas just kind of contribute to this islandy tropical flavor that it has. My problem is just that this all feels incredibly mild and middle of the road. To kind of elaborate on that, I had scattered observations of this thing, and then when it came time to actually record this video, I ended up just not feeling compelled to relay a single one to you because I'm just so indifferent towards all of this. And I think the only detail of it that I noticed that I know I have a strong opinion on is the outro of Posthumous Forgiveness. Like, it is pretty abrupt how it just like stops in its tracks and twists 180 degrees. Generally speaking, I feel like Kevin is like good at finding specific enough concepts to write about, but he's also really good at making them seem nondescript by just conveying them blandly. And then his falsetto is definitely not directing this album, it's more like just another instrument, which would be fine, but then my issues with the production come into play. Like, it's not the boldest thing in the world. I can usually just let myself ride all the synthetic mounds of sound without care because I'll primarily latch myself onto the high budget radiant finish and just let it make me feel like I've been sunbathing for too long, or like the expensive glitzy quality that it has just makes me feel like I'm driving on the streets of Los Angeles and like I'm a social media influencer, therefore I don't even need substance. But like, I can only angle my brain in that way for so long, and if I try to dig literally any deeper into a track, I'm usually unfulfilled. And like, these songs are just so long and draining and really suck the life out of you, and the experience can just be really numbing and feel like you've been hit with a stun gun. And I don't know why it's that way, because it feels like it should be a lot easier to get immersed in. It just feels kind of distant and blocked off for whatever reason, so I guess this thing just isn't my favorite thing in the world for like full focus listens. And next up, I want to cover the new Thundercat. I'm gonna start with the track Black Qualls because I feel like this is kind of like the epitome of why this album doesn't work for me. It just progresses very uncomfortably, first of all. Like, if you just take the post-chorus where all of these instruments are like stumbling forward and progressing in this hasty rush, and then the track just kind of like fumbles back into the much barer chorus with the buoyant chords. Like, I don't know if it's just me, but also I feel like the chorus and the verses in this track don't even sound like they complement each other enough to work together in one song, and it's really strange. And on top of that, so is the mixing. It's genuinely like the guests and instruments were just scattered randomly into this wide space, and then it was just recorded offhand, totally arbitrarily. Like, why? I just feel like the compositions and mixing on this thing are pretty spotty and can feel really loose and limp and just unconfident. Like, the mixing especially just makes me feel really lightheaded and just like my head is literal mush. And like, listening to this, I just get the sensation that it's all about to fall apart. Like, it's very shabby sounding, and I feel like it could have really benefited from stronger grooves and melodies because they're scantily that enticing here, and it just desperately needed some kind of pop factor about it. But I do feel like in his performances you can sense that he's a talented player, and like, I'm okay with the sound palette. I do think it sounds a bit cheap, but I also feel like you're meant to enjoy this album pretty casually anyway, and if you can embrace the blubbery, gurgly bass that's quite bouncy and just sprawling, and the slippery guitars and aerated keys, you're good. And I also feel like his falsetto sounds quite buoyant, and the instrumentals are really liquidy, so it's just like you're wading in these swirling psychedelic jazz soups, but like maybe ones that could use a bit more seasoning, heartier contents maybe, and they just kind of taste like broth. I feel like his singing never comes across as that serious a performance, it's more lax, so that kind of contributes to how loony his personality comes across and just how much of a fucking airhead he is. All things considered, I do think Thundercat's personality is probably the best part of this record, but like, even on that front, it doesn't really have a concise identity because like, you have tracks like Unrequited Love and Existential Dread, and then you have tracks like Dragon Ball Durag, and like, covering a range of topics or emotions is obviously not inherently a bad thing, but I feel like if you're Thundercat already and you want to say something with weight, you probably shouldn't have a mix of both. But Miguel's Happy Dance is one instance where I feel like these two worlds actually meet very comfortably, and like, the track just reminds me of like days where nothing is going right, but all I can really do is just like give a thumbs up and be like, fuck yeah, thanks so much. I'm not gonna lie, that is actually most days of my life. But yeah, my problem here again lies in the instrumental, and I just feel like with every single song here, like if there's something I like about it, there's also something I don't like. So I wasn't able to really have any takeaways from this thing and just ended up really lukewarm on it. Wouldn't really mind if I never heard it. But yeah, that concludes the 2020 roundup. I hope you enjoyed watching it. In terms of a year-end list, it's not gonna happen. Screw you guys, I hate you, see you never, bye. This is because I have already covered a lot of the records that would show up on it, and I just know, like, if I go into a year-end list and, like, know that it's a big official thing, like, I'll just sort of wear myself out working on it, and I don't think that that's something that I can handle right now, and it does feel like just retreading a lot of similar ground that I've already sort of worked through here. I think I am just gonna make a separate video talking about how I'm not making a year-end list, and then like I'll sort of talk about like my plans for the future, because at the current moment I don't really fucking know. But yeah, thanks so much for sticking around, and love you, and I'll see you whenever I see you.